So, over the last year, I have been obsessively reading books about the First World War. And partially this is because of a gap in my own education, because being raised as an American, the First World War for most Americans really only lasted a few months. Okay, yes, it lasted from 1917 to 1918, but in terms of the real American involvement of boots on the ground, it's basically April to November 1918. And so it's talked about in the history school books when I was growing up, but never really covered in detail. But the interesting thing is that, on the other hand, the First World War is the defining moment in Australian history. All right? The 25th of April, 1915, was the day that the Australian New Zealand Army Corps, or ANZAC, landed on the beaches of Gallipoli, and that's a picture of it. And that day, every year, is still celebrated as Anzac Day, and it's not celebrated by parades and everyone barbecuing. It is a solemn day. All right, people go to the war memorials, they cry, they put flowers out. It is an incredibly solemn day. And the reason it is because Australia lost 10% of its male population between 20 and 40 years old in the First World War. All right? 60,000 men died. That was 10%. And half of the men, even though there was no draft, and in fact, voters turned down a referendum on a draft in Australia twice during the First World War, still, half of the eligible men signed up and went to war, 300,000 of them. And for the ones who came back, most of them didn't live very long because the gas eventually killed them, maybe in the early 1920s, or a shrapnel wound that never healed, or some of them just couldn't bear to be living anymore and they shot themselves. And so all through the 1920s, there's this black period of Australian history. And in Australia, it is known now, it's the national origin myth. Australia itself is born on the beaches of Gallipoli. It's the foundation myth of Australia, because they sacrificed all for king and country, only to find out that the king was really only king in name, and the country they were fighting for, Britain, was not a country that they actually were citizens of. This is when Australians discovered that, in fact, they were Australians. But it took the sacrifice of the flower of Australian youth into the machine gun nests of Gallipoli before they could figure that out. Now, because I'm becoming one of the 25% of Australian citizens who were born overseas, I have been making an effort to understand at 100 years distance what the First World War was all about. And of course, it was a great war between great powers over the great game, which basically involved cutting up Asia and Africa into little pieces of protectorates and colonies and all that stuff. So you have Russia and Germany and Austria-Hungary and Italy and France and Great Britain, and have I forgotten anybody? I think that's the set of them. And what was happening is there was a destabilizing influence, because Germany had been a very sleepy nation for 200 years, and all of a sudden it's industrializing, and in 30 years' time, it comes from nowhere to become the greatest industrial power in the world. It's greater even than Great Britain. And all of a sudden the Germans are like, okay, it's time for us to rewrite the power book a little bit. And so on the 2nd of August in 1914, Germany invades Belgium. Not because it particularly wanted to invade Belgium, that was not the point. The point was to outflank the French and to actually just very quickly sweep down and basically conquer Paris. But of course you have to go through Belgium to do that, because they wanted to outflank them over the north. And of course, 25 years later, almost to the day, the Germans would go the other way in the second round. And historians now are starting to understand that the First and Second World Wars are not separate conflicts. There was simply a pause button, because both sides had fought to a standstill by 1918, and the pause came off in 1939. So, the First World War was the first conflict in Europe of the industrial era. The last time there had been a big war in Europe, it was Napoleon and Wellington, 1815. So there had been 100 years of development between those two. And it's interesting because in a recapitulation of the martial spirit of those European wars, the German army was led by mounted cavalry officers. And that's an artist's depiction of how they thought they'd really be looking as they marched into battle. They'd be men with swords, wreaking havoc and riding war horses, and it's the very Junker ideal of martial glory. That's exactly it, right there in an image. And they looked absolutely glorious until they ran into the first machine guns. And all of a sudden, there were bodies of men and horses 2 meters deep around Belgian pillboxes because the Belgians had decided they didn't really want to get rolled over. And guess what? The Germans were on horses, and the Belgians were in pillboxes with machine guns, and it was pretty much a turkey shoot. Now, it seems ridiculous now, in 2007, to imagine soldiers in battle charging swords in hand on their horses into machine guns. But they did this. They absolutely did this. They were hearkening back to a world that had already ended. And they were looking forward to a moment that would never come. Until the middle of 1917, you still had British cavalry officers that were expecting somewhere along the Somme battle line that moment would happen, and they would take up the charge and they would break through and drive the Hun back, waving around their swords from their horses. This idea was so deeply ingrained. And they thought that when they do that, they would win the war and cover themselves in everlasting glory, but this was not that war. And anyone who believed it was that war, well, they were taught otherwise very quickly and very fatally. And the mounted cavalry officer would not survive the selection pressure of the First World War. They simply disappeared from the battlefield. They couldn't survive machine gun or precision artillery or phosgene, or chlorine, or mustard gas. Now, after the opposing forces had fought themselves to a standstill, which took about 2 months, after the cull of the stupid and the unlucky and the poorly led, when innocence and ignorance had been wiped from the battlefield, a stalemate began, the trench line, that would last for 4 years, almost the entire duration of the war. Because try as they might, anything the generals tried, which was basically the only idea they had, was to throw more men at it. And they would periodically try to throw more men at it, and it wouldn't change anything, because both sides were pretty much evenly matched. And so all you could do was get a line that would move 500 meters one way or another. And so you have that in Verdun, you have that in the Somme, you have that on the Marne. And every confrontation would see the other adapting to whatever small changes in the techniques that would be happening. So each side had the same selection pressures of bombs and bullets and gas, and each side would use them against the other, so each side was basically unable to defeat the other. And so the Central Powers, that's Germany and Austria-Hungary, and the Allied powers, Russia, France, and England, basically ground against each other like gears in a piece of machinery that had jammed up, like an electric motor. And what happens if an electric motor, which is trying to drive a piece of gearing, jams itself up? What does it do? It throws off heat, because the current is still pouring through. The current of human culture is still pouring through this war. There's still all of this energy and material that's being thrown into the battle, but it's not going anywhere. Nothing's happening. So that heat becomes now another refiner's fire, another set of selection pressures, where strategies and technologies and tactics are going to be subject to the most thorough testing possible and the most honest testing possible, because at the end of the day, you're either a dead soldier or you're not. There's no way that you can lie about the selection pressures in war. So, when something did work, the opposing side would either be forced to adapt to it or they'd have to face defeat. And so the First World War is the archetype for selection pressure, for natural selection, because the only things that survived the First World War were either the most fit or the luckiest, because wars place enormous, absolutely unprecedented selection pressures on culture, on people, on technologies, everything. Natural selection in time of war runs absolutely wild, and it weeds out everything that's poorly adapted to the environment, such as, say, the Tsar, or the Kaiser, or the Holy Roman Empire, or the mounted cavalry, or the trench lines, or the small professional elite class of soldiers. They're all gone now. They don't exist. They've been selected against. So much that was born in the First World War didn't survive it, and so much that was born before the First World War was wiped out, was rolled over by it. The configuration of European culture, and really by extension American culture and global culture, was completely different after the First World War. So, that was then. This is now.